It is my distinct honor to introduce Dr. Nick Bostrom, a renowned thought leader on topics such as existential risk, superintelligence, and indeed the very future of our species. Dr. Bostrom serves as a professor at Oxford University and is the founding director of the Future of Humanity Institute, which is a multidisciplinary research institute at Oxford University studying big picture questions for human civilization. You may know him from his critically acclaimed book, Superintelligence, Paths, Danger Strategies, which didn't merely scale the peaks of the New York Times bestseller list, but ignited a global discourse on artificial intelligence, exploring its future paths, existential risks, and unveiling strategies that might govern our coexistence with these synthetic intellects. His prowess in philosophical discourse and futuristic thought is globally recognized, earning him a place in Foreign Policy's top 100 global thinkers list twice, and earning him a distinguished position amongst Prospect's world thinkers. Intriguingly, he has a book in the works on a topic yet to be disclosed. Without further ado, please join me in extending a warm virtual welcome to the renowned author, Dr. Nick Bostrom.
And also in the last 12 months or so, a really profound shift in the public discourse around AI. There have been a small community of people who have, for a couple of decades, been thinking about what would happen if AI really started to succeed and the kinds of safety issues and security concerns that might arise. But this was, for the longest time, really a fringe occupation. Most people sort of dismissed it as idle speculation, science fiction, doom mongering, and there were a few people hacking away at that on the sidelines. But over the last 6 to 12 months, really, we've seen the profound shift where some of these questions, including, concerns about existential risks from superintelligence and so on, have really hit the mainstream. And right now, as we speak, of course, here in the UK, there is this global summit on AI, which is just the latest of a series of high-level policy maker interventions in this space. And I think if we take a bird's eye view of the current situation, there's like a bunch of different facets of this AI challenge that we can identify. So first, there is all the things that people have been looking at for a long time, which are more present day issues and current harms and concerns with how these systems might be used, threats to privacy, intellectual property, discrimination, etc., etc. So that's all still there. But then in addition to that, as we are looking towards potentially more transformative AI developments, I think we can identify 3 broad clusters of issues. One is the technical problem of developing scalable methods for AI alignment. So these would be methods for ensuring that AI systems remain on task, that they do what their creators intend for them to do, and don't do things that they are not intended to do, even as these systems become more general in their capabilities and more intelligent and eventually perhaps superhumanly capable in various domains. And this has received a lot more attention in the last few years. The leading AI labs that are developing frontier models now all have highly capable research teams focusing specifically on this issue, and it is starting to be discussed much more in the general public and also to some extent amongst policymakers. And there are kind of several aspects of that one can distinguish if one zooms in a little bit. So there are like potential concerns from misuse or applications of increasingly powerful AI systems. This would include, for instance, the concern that the next generation of large language models might lend themselves to people who want to make biological weapons or massive cybercrime, and there is a need to prevent these models from giving that kind of assistance and probably to test them in advance of deployment through red teaming techniques and other measures to ensure that that I won't provide those capabilities to users. And then beyond that, also questions of autonomous AI systems that might themselves pose these kind of more traditional risks that have been discussed, including in my 2014 book about sort of AI's taking over or posing a threat to the human species. So over various timescales, which still remain uncertain, but now with a non-trivial probability of just a few years, I think these questions are coming to the fore. So that's the first cluster of issues, sort of broadly speaking, AI alignment. A second big cluster of issues is what we might term AI governance. And this encompasses a whole swath of different challenges related to how this technology, even if we have the technical means of constructing particular AI systems so that they behave as intended, how we then have a national and perhaps international governance regime that ensures that these systems predominantly are used for positive ends. This intersects with the first, like if you have challenges in aligning AI systems, you might also need some regulatory regime that limits who is able to build cutting edge systems. But it also includes a whole host of other things, like these systems could be used for all manner of purposes, from automating propaganda to autonomous weapons to obviously a huge host of positive uses as well. So that broadly is what we might think of as the kind of governance challenge. But then, and this is what I want to spend the remainder of my time focusing on, I think there is a third big bucket that has so far received much less attention. And this is the issue of the potential moral status of digital minds. The idea being that either now or at some point, as we create increasingly complex and sophisticated AI systems, these might become not just mere objects or tools like hammers and cars, but they might become entities whose interests matter in their own right. So that you might think of the first of these big buckets, the alignment, like to make sure that the AI systems don't harm us. And the governance challenge, broadly speaking, is how can we make sure that we don't harm each other using AI tools? And then this third bucket is how can we make sure that we don't harm the AIs? Now, this is still a little bit outside the Overton window. I would say that currently the conversation relating to this third area is roughly where the first area, AI alignment, was maybe 5 or 10 years ago. Some people are starting to think about it, but it's not yet really on the radar of top-level policymakers or most practitioners in the field of artificial intelligence. But just as AI alignment has moved from being a kind of fringe occupation of a few people in academia or on the sidelines or some clever people debating it on the internet and has moved into the mainstream, I think a similar shift will need to happen sometime between now and the next several years with respect to this question of the moral status of digital minds. It needs to become clarified, mainstreamed, and become a topic for much broader conversation. Let me say something briefly about what the challenges are in this domain. And I think they are quite perplexing and difficult to get one's head around. And I certainly don't have the complete answer to what ought to be done in this space. But it seems plausible, at least to me, that a lot of non-human animals have various degrees of moral status. And this is in fact widely recognized in law. If you are a biomedical researcher and you want to test some drugs on like 100 mice. Like there are fairly strict regulations for how to go about that. You need approval from ethics committees. If you're going to perform surgery on these mouse, you need to anesthetize them. There are rules about the size of the cages that they need to have, etc., etc. And of course we have laws against animal abuse, etc. There's still a lot to be desired in terms of how we treat animals, particularly in the food industry. But there is at least some basic general recognition that animals, at least some animals, matter to some degree for their own sake. It's wrong to kick the dog because it would hurt the dog, and similarly with at least some other animals. And it is not at all obvious that even some current AI systems are not, in many respects, at least equivalent to some non-human animals. Different, obviously, but not obviously in ways that would mean that they would have less moral status. We don't have a very clear understanding of what the necessary and sufficient criteria are for a complex computational system to be conscious, to have sentience, to have the ability to have subjective experiences. There's a lot of disagreement about that. If you take off the shelf some of the theories that have been developed for the criteria for consciousness and just apply them to current day AI systems, some of these systems would satisfy a lot of those criteria. That might be that our current theories are wrong, but at least it's some prima facie reason for at least not being extremely confident that there is absolutely nothing going on inside these systems. We should be maybe a little bit humble about our ability to understand that. And I think obviously the case for thinking that there could be sentience in some of these systems will increase, most likely as these systems become increasingly sophisticated with a wider repertoire of behavior. I think that aside from the question of whether these systems have phenomenal experience, I think there could be alternative, additional possible grounds for why they might have various degrees of moral status. I think the ability to suffer or experience pain might be a sufficient reason for having moral status, but I think not a necessary one. I think if you have a system, for example, that is the equivalent of a human person, that maybe has a conception of self as existing through time, has preferences, has maybe the ability to enter into reciprocal social relationships, I think the case would be quite strong that such systems could have various forms of moral status, that it would be wrong to completely disregard their interests and preferences. And again, the case that at least some systems will satisfy these criteria will increase as we develop more and more sophisticated AI systems. So I think there's like a reasonably strong prima facie case that possibly some currently existing AI systems, but at any rate, AI systems that might be built over the next few years might sort of enter into the region where it becomes a live question whether they might not have various degrees of moral status. And since these systems could be produced in great numbers or run in huge numbers of instances, it might matter quite a lot that this population of digital minds fare well in the future. In the long-term future, maybe most minds will be digital rather than biological. And so getting this right is really quite important. Now, I would hasten to emphasize here that recognizing that some particular AI has moral status, even a high level of moral status, even if some future system, say, has the same level of moral status as a human being, that means it matters a lot how it's treated. It doesn't mean that it should be treated the same as a human being. Digital minds are very different and they might have very different needs. some things that might be very wrong to do to a human might be perfectly fine to do to a digital mind, and some things that might be very unnecessary to do to a human might be essential for a digital mind. So we need to think about the moral principles that would be relevant for ensuring the welfare of digital minds. We really need to think things through from the ground up, and we can't just transport a lot of the sort of mid-level moral principles we have developed for trying to accommodate human interests and moral status and just blindly apply them to the case of digital minds. Let me give some examples of how we might need to rethink some fairly fundamental moral principles if we are considering this kind of scenario where we would be sharing the world with digital minds with moral status. So take, for example, the principle of democracy, of one person, one vote, which makes a lot of sense in the human case, because although humans are different, they are all sort of similar. But now consider a case where you have a human-like digital mind, and one might first think, well, it then deserves the same as a biological human being. But if you apply this principle of one person, one vote to a scenario where you have digital minds, where maybe you could, the day before the election, make 100,000 copies of yourself, and then the day after the election, maybe you merge all of these together again, one can immediately see that it becomes quite problematic then, whether each of these 100,000 minds should each be given one vote. You could imagine more extreme scenarios where basically elections would just be won by whichever faction happened to have the most hardware available at the time of the election to sort of make a crazy number of copies. In that context, this simple principle of one person, one vote no longer seems to be sensible, and one would have to maybe think of some other way of allocating political influence. And it would require more thinking to figure out what that might be, but maybe political voting influence would have to be weighted by some other factor, the amount of compute power that a clan of digital mind is using, or some other thing. But it's certainly one instance where one can't just directly, it seems, import the human principle to the digital arena. And another is death. Like, that's really bad for a human to die. It's like one of the worst things. But death for a digital mind might be quite different. When a human dies, they are sort of irreversibly gone. You can't pause a human and then restart them. But with a digital mind, if you save them to disk and then load them up again, it might be no big deal. Even if you erase them, if you have stored enough of a record that you could sort of easily retrain them on the same training data set, that might also mean something different. Some digital minds might be designed so as to absolutely not care at all in any way about their being terminated, and in that case, maybe it's not such a great matter if they are quote unquote killed. Maybe for other digital minds it would be a big matter, but again, this general assumption that we would have in the human case, that terminating somebody's murder, which is one of the worst possible crimes, may not hold for all digital minds. One would have to look at this on a case-by-case basis. Another example, with humans, we have adopted the principle of freedom of reproduction. So everybody is free to have as many kids as they want, or to have no kids. And we also have the principle that every child deserves at least some minimal level of welfare. So if some parents have kids that they are not able to take care of, then the state should step in and provide basic education and food, etc. And this makes a lot of sense in the human case. If you have the same principle just sort of blindly applied to the digital context, it seems you would very quickly find unacceptable consequences. A digital mind could if it had the resources, make millions of copies, over a day, and then each of those millions of copies, if there is available hardware, could make another million copies. And you can't then have a welfare system that provides each of those 10 to the power of 12 copies with a certain level of welfare. You would just very quickly run out of resources. So there seems then to be a tension between these two principles. On the one hand, freedom of reproduction, and on the other hand, the principle that every offspring should have a minimal level of well-being. So something would have to yield. I think probably in that context, the freedom of reproduction, that maybe you would only be allowed to make more copies of digital minds if you could show in advance that you had enough resources to give it a tolerable level of existence. You can go through the list. There are many other ways in which the moral situation with digital minds would diverge quite radically from the case with humans. Let me give a few more examples. So collective responsibility is a principle we, generally speaking, have rejected in the case of humans. Collective punishment is wrong, and each person should only be held accountable for what they themselves have done. This possibly needs to be qualified with digital minds, where they could be much more similar to each other than any humans are to each other. You could have literal copies that might behave in exactly the same way, and if one digital mind had some criminal intent or wanted to do something nefarious, it shouldn't be able to do that by just designing another digital mind that went off and do that, and then that other digital mind was penalized if it were caught, but the original was left intact. And so when you have much more fine-grained control over the kinds of minds you might create, then possibly the creator of the mind, not just a mind that actually commits the crime, would have to be held accountable in order to have an overall incentive structure that works for preventing the kinds of actions we don't want to see. Another interesting one is what I call mind crime. So with humans, we have not just freedom of speech, but perhaps even more fundamentally, freedom of thought. We are each free to think whatever we want to think, to imagine whatever we want to imagine, and that's really fundamental. And I mean, both because obviously it would be impractical to try to police this, since you can't really see what somebody's thinking, but even then, it seems like the most sacred of the inner sanctums for the human person. But if you have sufficiently powerful digital minds, you could envisage scenarios in which sometimes when it imagines things in certain sufficiently detailed ways, for example, imagining a scene in which some sentient being is hurt, that sentient being that is imagined, if it's imagined in a sufficiently fine granularity, might actually come to exist in itself and suffer. So a digital mind might simulate other minds within itself, and those minds might have moral status. In which cases, this principle of freedom of thought might have to be curtailed to prevent these kind of internal transgression and abuses. If your mind was powerful enough that just by thinking, you could actually bring into existence other separate little minds within your own mind, then the idea that you could just think any scenario you want, even of other minds getting hurt and so forth, might have to be limited. You could imagine scenarios in which privacy concerns would be potentially violated by sufficiently powerful minds. So you could have an AI system, if it were sufficiently capable of, say, from a picture of a clothed person, it could generate a sufficiently accurate representation of what that person would look like without clothes, and then publish that might be a privacy violation. Or if you could have an AI system that just by reading a bunch of stuff that somebody had written, could form a sufficiently accurate picture of what that person was thinking, that might raise issues of our mental privacy. we sort of live with the idea that people can sort of infer a little bit about what we're thinking from what we say and our facial expressions, and it's like that's part of what it is to be a social person, and we generally like that and like empathy. But you could imagine some sort of super empathy that we just think would get too far, and that it would be creepy to have some mind that really just saw right through you like an X-ray in some sort of radically superhuman way. Similarly with freedom of speech, if you had AI systems that were like super persuaders, that were really able to just read through you, and then by having seen and read about millions or billions of other people, just could form such an accurate model of you that basically they had the ability to persuade you to anything that they wanted to, then it might be that you would have to limit the ability for those types of super persuaders to interact directly with unprotected humans. It might have to be an interaction mediated by some sort of AI agent acting on behalf of the human and sort of filtering this persuasive influence that was coming in. So these are a few different ways. There are other ways in which digital minds can be different. Like, for example, like all humans run basically at the same speed, but digital minds, by moving them to faster or slower hardware, could, they're sort of the rate at which they have subjective experience could vary by many orders of magnitude. And these, I think, are all very complex and baffling questions to think about. How even setting aside practicalities and political realities, just even in principle, what would a future look like where there were human beings as we are now, maybe some enhanced human beings, some small AIs, some big super intelligent AIs, some human uploads, human animals, like where all of these very different forms of morally relevant being could coexist in some happy equilibrium. I think will require a lot of thought, and we are just a very, very long way right now from even having some conception of what that would look like. But the technology is moving quite rapidly, so I think the time is now to start at least beginning to develop some of the relevant concepts that we will need for this conversation to take place, and ultimately for our political systems and our moral intuitions and our regulatory systems to adapt to this. Let me close by like a few small suggestions for how one might get started with this. Like, so the boring one, but which is true, I think, is like more research is needed. Like, we just need to start to think about this. I think it would be nice if well-resourced leading-edge AI labs had somebody on their staff who was designated to care about these issues, as an algorithmic welfare officer, if you want. Initially, maybe they would do other things as well, but they would sort of be responsible for being a node that could plug into the wider research community that is starting to think about these things, and in general could be on the lookout for opportunities to see if there are things that can be done to improve the welfare of AIs that are being developed, or to look out for their interests. I think some low-cost initial things that one might consider is making sure that big AIs that are currently run, when they are no longer needed, are saved to disk permanently, so that in the future, if it turns out that they were poorly treated, there might be an opportunity to compensate them. In the future, if things go well, we will have enormous resources and we will have figured out AI safety, and at that point it could be super cheap to just boot up some of these old AIs, and if they suffered some unfortunate experiences in their youth, they could then have like a great long happy as it were afterlife or continuation. So that could be quite cheap to take periodic snapshots of these and just store that to disk somewhere. I think one could develop better methods for trying to ascertain whether AI systems have preferences, and if so, what those preferences are. The most obvious way, but also a very limited and flawed way, is through self-report. With these large language models, you can ask them. I think on its own, that's not a really reliable guide, because it would be trivially easy during training to either shape them such that they always claim that they are not conscious and happy with whatever, or conversely to say that they are very conscious and they want X, Y, or Z. And so if you deliberately shape them during training to sort of verbally output X, then the fact that they output X in the end might not be very much evidence of anything at all as to what is going on inside them. But you could avoid deliberately biasing their verbal outputs in that way. And you could furthermore train them to have some kind of mode of truthfulness, and then see what they say when asked about their internal interests and experiences when sort of operating in that mode of truthfulness. You could then try to correlate that using mechanistic interpretability techniques to see, for example, when they claim to be aware or not of some particular stimulus, whether that corresponds to some internal structure that, according to some of these current theories we have, would be a plausible candidate for mental content. And there are some other ideas like that you could try to do something more than the most naive possible way to try to elicit what there might be in terms of preferences for these AIs. There might be other ideas when using reinforcement learning to try to shift, and here it's kind of a little bit conceptually murky at the moment what exactly it even means. But for humans, obviously there's a big difference between being motivated by getting more pleasure and rewards versus trying to avoid pain and negative reinforcement. And we think it's great to sort of motivate children to learn more in school by giving them praise when they're doing well, but like we wouldn't want a system where they get electric shocks when they fail. And so one might think about whether there would be analogous distinctions to be made with respect to reinforcement learning paradigms in machine learning, whether there might be a way, as it were, to run it more on positive reinforcement rather than negative reinforcement. Like in the naive way of just applying this, it's not really clear that it makes sense if it's just sort of putting a plus to 2000 after every number and then sort of rescaling it, like that might not make sense. But since it's such a profound difference in the human case, there might be some analogous computational distinction that it would be good to understand, and then perhaps to try to shift reinforcement learning regimes more to run on what might intuitively correspond to sort of gradients of pleasure. I've only been able to scratch the surface of this, but I want to leave some time now at the end to see if there are any questions. So I'll pause there, and thank you for your attention.
Sure, Nick. Thank you so much. We do have some questions. We might not be able to cover them all, but we can take a few. So we have one question from Nishi here, who asks us, hello, would you please elaborate a bit on how we can not harm AI? Really interesting thought there, and she would like to know more about it.
Yeah, I think step one would be to affirm in principle that yes, some AIs at some point may matter morally, and we should start to care about that, even if that's all there is for now, like this vague non-committal thing. I think that's better than nothing. Then you could have people on the lookout for this, and we will need more research and thinking to figure out exactly what that means to not harm an AI, or which AIs are even capable of being harmed. I think to the extent that an AI is capable of giving verbal consent, you should at least avoid doing things that it objects to. That's a very weak criterion, and it wouldn't catch many cases of AIs that are sort of trained to verbally assent to things, even if there were something bad going on inside them. But at least if they do object, that's a big red flag. Then, as I say, you could save them to disk so that if we are doing something wrong now, there would at least be the possibility later to compensate for them. And then I hope that we will get gradually a better understanding of how to sort of apply these intuitive human concepts we have for what it means to respect the human being's interest, not to cause a human being pain and suffering, etc., etc. How sort of to translate that into computational terms that could be applied to AIs, but it will require more research to do that properly. Thank you very much, and feel free to email me as well if you have further thoughts or questions on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. Bye.
Bye.